The rain in Seoul does not wash the streets clean. It only turns the city into a smear of cold, electric color. Neon signs bleed into the asphalt, casting long, distorted reflections that pulse with the rhythm of the traffic. Every drop that hits the pavement creates a sharp, rhythmic tapping that echoes against the glass of the high-rises. The air tastes of ozone and damp concrete, heavy enough to cling to the skin. Down in the alleys, the steam rises from vents, swirling into the darkness before being swallowed by the downpour. It is a place that never truly sleeps, yet it feels profoundly empty. To anyone standing outside the warmth of its windows, the lights blur into streaks of violet and harsh white, flickering like a dying pulse. There is no silence here, only a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the soles of one's shoes. It is a city of millions, yet the rain creates a private, suffocating barrier around anyone caught in it. Everything is in motion, yet everything remains frozen in place. Amanda moved away from the neon haze of the streets and toward the river. The Han River Bridge stretched out into the blackness, a thin line of steel suspended over moving water. She reached the center, where the wind hit with full force, tearing at her breath. She stopped. The railing was slick with rain, biting into her palms with a metallic chill that cut right through her skin. She gripped the metal, her fingers locking tight, the pressure forcing the blood from her knuckles until they stood out as white, jagged points against the dark. Below, the water was a churning, invisible mass, pulling at the bridge supports with a relentless, heavy force. She did not move. The bridge vibrated under the weight of passing traffic, a rhythmic thrum that traveled up her arms and settled into her chest. She leaned forward. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough edge of a folded envelope. She pulled it out. The paper was already softening, the rain soaking through the fibers. She shielded it with her body, turning her back to the wind, and pried the paper open. Inside was a one-way ticket to Kentucky. The ink of the departure time was beginning to bleed, turning the letters into dark, illegible stains. She stared at the destination, but the name of her hometown triggered no warmth. It felt like a place belonging to a version of herself that no longer existed. She had left 3 years ago with a suitcase full of ambition, and now she was returning with nothing but a damp piece of paper in a hollow chest. The ticket was a tether to a life that had become a stranger to her. She looked at the printed date, then back at the dark, swirling water below. There was no comfort in the thought of returning. Kentucky was a ghost, and Seoul had become a cage. She was suspended between 2 points on a map. The paper slipped in her grip, nearly caught by a gust of wind, and she snatched it back, pressing it against her palm until her skin burned. She was not going home. She pulled her hand away from the railing and stood upright. The movement was stiff, a sharp departure from the fluid, deliberate grace that once defined her. 3 years ago, she moved through crowds with a spine that never bent, her shoulders squared, her chin held at an angle that demanded space. She had walked with the steady, rhythmic pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Now, her shoulders slumped, pulled down by the weight of the rain. She pressed her palms against her thighs, feeling the tremor in her muscles. She forced herself to stand tall, trying to reclaim that old, quiet strength. She took a deep breath, focusing on the expansion of her ribs, the way her lungs pushed against the constriction of her chest. She remembered how she used to enter a room, the way she would pause to assess the light, the layout, the people, before moving with purpose. That woman was still inside, buried under layers of disappointment and the cold, damp air of the bridge. She tilted her head back, letting the rain hit her face, and for a fleeting second, the tremor in her hands stopped. She was not the broken thing the city had tried to make her. She was simply waiting for the next move. The memory hit with the force of a sudden shift in pressure. 3 years earlier, the automatic doors at Incheon Airport had slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. She remembered the air inside cool, filtered, and smelling of floor wax and anticipation. She had stepped through the threshold with 2 heavy suitcases, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the polished tile. Each bag was packed with the essentials of a life she was ready to leave behind, and the tools for the one she intended to build. She stopped at the arrivals gate, shifting the weight of the handles in her palms, and scanned the sea of faces. She had a contract in her folder and a teaching license that felt like a key to a new world. She walked toward the transit line, her stride long and purposeful, eyes darting to the signage, mapping out the route to her new life. There was no hesitation in her movements then. She had navigated the terminal with the focus of a pilot, ignoring the fatigue of the long flight. She had come to teach, to shape minds, and to carve out a space in a culture that was entirely foreign. She had reached the platform, set her suitcases down, and watched the train pull in. She was ready to begin. The transition from the sterile airport to the heart of Hongdae was a violent shift in rhythm. The streets were a labyrinth of flashing lights and competing sounds. Music blared from hidden speakers, bass vibrating through the pavement and into the soles of her feet. She pushed through the dense crowds, dodging shoulders and umbrellas, her senses stretched to the breaking point. The sheer volume of the city felt like a physical weight, a constant, abrasive hum that made it impossible to find a steady rhythm. She turned down a narrow side street, hoping for a reprieve, but the noise only deepened. Every storefront was a wall of sound. She felt the frantic pace of the district pulling at her, a chaotic tide that threatened to sweep her away. She ducked into a doorway to catch her breath, her pulse racing, in sync with the city's frantic tempo. Then, she stepped into a small, recessed coffee shop. The heavy glass door swung shut behind her. The roar of the street vanished instantly, replaced by the low, rhythmic hiss of an espresso machine. The air was still, heavy with the scent of roasted beans. She looked up, and there, amidst the sudden, unexpected silence, she saw him. The chaos of the city finally stopped. He sat at a corner table, his fingers curled loosely around a ceramic mug. He didn't look up immediately, his attention fixed on a book resting on the wooden surface. There was a deliberate stillness to him that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy she had just escaped. He moved with a relaxed economy, shifting his weight slightly to adjust his position, his hands retreating into the warmth of his sleeves. When he finally noticed her, he didn't startle. He simply tilted his head, his expression shifting into a slow, measured curiosity. He set the mug down, the ceramic clicking softly against the wood, and offered a nod that felt like an invitation. He stood up, his movements fluid and unhurried, and gestured toward the empty chair across from him. He was not just a stranger. He was a focal point, a person who occupied his own space with an effortless, magnetic grace. The cafe door opened, and the city rushed back in, but the roar had lost its edge. They walked side by side, their pace matching perfectly, a synchronized rhythm that cut through the dense foot traffic of Hongdae. When the crowd surged, he moved to the street side, guiding her with a light touch on her elbow. She watched the way he navigated the intersections, his eyes scanning for the shortest path through the sea of people. He didn't just walk. He moved with a practiced ease that made the concrete maze feel like a familiar hallway. She stopped to look at a neon sign, and he stopped with her, waiting until she was ready to move again. There was no rush, no pressure to keep up with the frantic tempo of the district. She felt the weight of the city lift. Every corner turned was a shared discovery. Every street lamp, a marker of their growing orbit. He pulled a transit card from his pocket and tapped the reader, his movement sharp and practiced. He held the gate open, waiting for her to pass through, his eyes tracking her progress through the turnstile. He pointed to the overhead map, his finger tracing the complex web of lines that Amanda had previously found impenetrable. He explained the color-coded system, his voice dropping to a low pitch to match the hum of the approaching train. When she hesitated at the platform edge, he stepped closer, his hand firm on her shoulder to steady her. He showed her how to stand against the flow of the crowd, how to anticipate the doors, and where to position herself. She stopped trying to read the signs herself and started watching his face for cues. Every instruction he gave became a tether. She followed his lead through the labyrinth of tunnels, her own instincts fading. She was learning to exist only within the space he defined. They ducked into a narrow shop where the air was thick with the scent of fermented peppers and garlic. Minho ordered without looking at the menu, his voice confident against the clatter of metal bowls. When the stew arrived, it bubbled violently, a deep red broth that promised a searing heat. Amanda took a cautious spoonful, and the spice hit the back of her throat like a physical blow. Her eyes watered instantly. Min-ho reached across the table, sliding his own bowl of cold water toward her and pressing a folded napkin into her hand. He watched her recover, his expression shifting from amusement to a soft, focused attention. They ate in a rhythm, the heat of the food forcing them to slow down, to lean in, to exist in the small circle of steam between them. Outside, the subway rumble vibrated through the floorboards, but it no longer sounded like a threat. The city began to reflect the version of her that Min-ho seemed to see. When they walked through the crowded markets of Hongdae, she stopped looking at the ground and started looking at the reflections in the glass storefronts. She saw a woman who belonged, a woman who moved with purpose because he was by her side. Every time he introduced her to a new shopkeeper or a hidden alleyway, he did so with a pride that made her stand taller. She felt chosen. It was a physical sensation, a warmth that settled in her chest. Whenever he caught her eye across a crowded room, she started to measure her own worth by the length of his gaze and the frequency of his smiles. The uncertainty that had plagued her first few months in Seoul began to evaporate. She stopped checking her phone for messages from home. She stopped comparing her life here to the one she left behind. She was no longer a stranger navigating a foreign land. She was a partner in a shared reality. She breathed in the neon-lit air and felt a profound sense of arrival. He had given her a map, a language, and a sense of self. She was finally visible, and for now, that was enough. The first frost arrived in late November, turning the city air brittle and sharp. The transition was subtle at first, a slight hardening in the way the wind whipped through the streets. Inside their favorite cafes, the warmth that once felt like a sanctuary began to thin. Amanda noticed the change in the small, quiet spaces between their conversations. Where there had once been a constant flow of shared observations, there was now a growing, heavy silence. One evening, as they walked toward the subway, the temperature plummeted. Amanda reached out, her hand seeking his to tuck into his pocket, a habit born of their early months. He shifted his weight, pulling his arm away just enough to adjust his scarf. The movement was quick, almost mechanical, but it left her hand grasping at empty air. She kept walking, her fingers curling into a fist to hide the tremor. The winter had truly arrived. The silence migrated from the streets into the digital space between them. Amanda began to treat her phone like a lifeline, checking the screen every few minutes for a notification that never arrived. A simple text about dinner plans turned into a 4-hour vigil. She watched the cursor blink, then vanish, then blink again, her pulse syncing with the rhythm of the empty inbox. She found herself staring at the timestamp of his last message, calculating the hours since he had last acknowledged her existence. The anxiety was a physical weight, pressing against her ribs whenever she entered a crowded subway car or walked past a cafe they used to frequent. She would type out a question, delete it, and type it again, only to lock the screen in frustration. The hours bled into days, and the days stretched into a hollow, agonizing routine. She stopped looking at the people around her, her world shrinking down to the black glass in her palm. The city continued its chaotic pulse, indifferent to the quiet desperation unfolding in her hands. Every vibration of a stranger's phone made her flinch, a sharp reminder of the connection that was fraying in real time. She was waiting for a signal, a word, but the screen remained dark. The restaurant was a small, dimly lit space tucked away in a side alley, smelling of heavy spices and burnt oil. They sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table that felt miles wide. Amanda ordered the stew they had shared a dozen times, hoping the familiar heat would thaw the air between them. She watched him settle into his chair, his posture slumped, his focus already drifting toward the device in his palm. She spoke, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the kitchen, asking about his day, about the project he had mentioned earlier that week. He didn't look up. His thumb moved in a rhythmic, hypnotic scroll, flicking through images and text that existed in a world she couldn't see. The overhead light flickered, casting stuttering shadows across his face, highlighting the total lack of expression in his eyes. She sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching him exist in a space she was no longer invited to enter. The air between them felt heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of his detachment. Amanda watched him, her own meal forgotten, the steam from the bowl dissipating into the cold air of the room. She needed to know he was still there, still with her. Slowly, she shifted her weight, leaning forward until her fingertips hovered just inches from his hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt far too loud in the quiet space. She reached out, her skin brushing against his knuckles. The contact lasted only a fraction of a second. Before her palm could fully settle against his, he jerked his hand back, as if burned. He didn't look at her. Instead, he pulled his hand away to reach for his neck, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his scarf to adjust it. The movement was sharp, dismissive, and final. He turned his head slightly, his gaze remaining fixed on the glowing screen. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into a tight fist, the reality of his distance crashing down on her with absolute, crushing clarity. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight pressing against her chest. Amanda sat frozen, her hand still hovering in the empty space where his had been just moments before. She looked around the restaurant, seeing the other couples leaning into each other, their heads close, their worlds overlapping. Here, there was only a vast, unbridgeable chasm between her chair and his. She watched him breathe, watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders, yet he seemed to exist in a different dimension entirely. She tried to speak, her throat tight, the words forming but dying before they could reach the air. She realized then that she could have stood up, walked out the door, or even screamed, and he would not have shifted his gaze from that glowing screen. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the periphery of a man who no longer acknowledged her existence. The realization settled into her bones, colder than the winter wind rattling the window pane. She was not just alone. She was invisible to the very person who had once been her entire world. She left the restaurant without a word, the bell above the door chiming a hollow sound that vanished into the street noise. Outside, Seoul was a blur of neon and motion, a river of people moving with purpose, yet she felt like a stone dropped into a current. She walked, her pace aimless, trying to find the rhythm that used to make this city feel like home. Every corner she turned felt like a repetition of the last, a loop of cold light and indifference. She stopped by a street vendor, the smell of spicy food rising in the air, but the scent that once promised comfort now only made her stomach churn. She looked at the faces passing by, searching for a mirror of her own confusion, but found only strangers locked in their own private orbits. She pressed her palms against the cold brick of a building, seeking a physical anchor, but the surface was as unyielding as the silence she had left behind. She stood there, a solitary figure against the rushing tide of the city, finally understanding that the void was not just in the room, it was everywhere. The subway platform was a cavern of flickering lights and stale air. Amanda descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing against the concrete, and stepped into the metal carriage just as the doors hissed shut. The train lurched forward, a rhythmic, grinding screech that vibrated through the floorboards. She found a seat near the window, watching the dark tunnel walls blur into a smear of gray. Across the aisle, a young couple sat pressed together, sharing a pair of earbuds, their heads nodding in unison to a silent beat. She looked away, her gaze catching her own reflection in the darkened glass, a pale, ghost-like outline against the passing tunnel lights. She pulled a book from her bag, trying to focus on the lines of text, but the letters swam and dissolved. The train slowed, the brakes squealing in a high-pitched protest as it pulled into the next station. People surged in, a tide of bodies that pressed against her space, yet no one looked her way. She was surrounded by dozens of people, all tethered to one another, while she drifted in a vacuum of her own making. The doors opened, the cold air rushed in, and she realized the train was moving toward a destination she no longer recognized. Every stop was just another reminder. Back in their apartment, Amanda tried to reset the atmosphere. She spent hours preparing a meal, the kitchen filling with the sharp, familiar scent of spices she knew he liked. She set the table with care, placing the bowls precisely, hoping the ritual would anchor them to the past. When he finally walked through the door, he didn't look at the food. He didn't look at her. He dropped his keys on the counter with a metallic clatter that cut through the silence and walked straight to the bedroom. She followed him, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She brought up the weekend trip they had taken months ago, a small attempt to remind him of the connection they had once shared. He didn't turn around. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, and began scrolling through his phone. She stepped closer, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder, but he shifted his weight, creating a sharp, deliberate distance. Every word she offered was met with a shrug or a grunt, a wall of indifference that felt more aggressive than a shout. The apartment grew dim as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Amanda stood in the center of the living room, watching the overhead light pulse with a weak, rhythmic stutter. It was a dying flicker, a frantic attempt to hold onto the current before giving up entirely. She reached for the switch, clicking it off and on, but the bulb only groaned with a faint, electrical hum before going dark. The room plunged into a gray, heavy twilight. She moved to the utility closet, rummaging through the shelves for a spare, but her fingers found only dust and empty cardboard boxes. The silence of the apartment felt pressurized, thick with the weight of things unsaid. She returned to the living room. Min-ho remained motionless in the corner, his face obscured by the gloom, his presence reduced to the soft, rhythmic tap of his fingers against his phone screen. The light had not just failed, it had surrendered. She watched the last of the warmth drain from the walls, realizing that the darkness was no longer an accident. Amanda sat on the edge of the sofa, her eyes fixed on the blank wall. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound, it was a mirror. She began to dissect her own actions, replaying every conversation of the past month like a film on a loop. Had she been too demanding? Had her questions about his day sounded like an interrogation? She stood and paced the narrow length of the room, her footsteps muffled by the rug. She stopped by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, and wondered if her presence was the weight that had finally snapped the tension. She looked at her reflection in the dark pane, searching for the version of herself that he had once smiled at. It felt like a stranger. She traced the line of her jaw, questioning if her expectations were simply too heavy for him to carry. Every doubt she had suppressed surfaced, sharp and insistent. She convinced herself that if she had been quieter, or perhaps less visible, he might still be the person she met in that cafe. She sat back down, pulling her knees to her chest, and accepted the heavy, hollow thought that she was the variable. The distance was the result of her own inability to be enough. Tuesday arrived with the gray, muted light of a city struggling to wake. Amanda moved through the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of boiling water and grinding beans acting as a desperate anchor. She set 2 mugs on the table, the steam rising in thin, wispy ribbons that vanished into the cold air. Min-ho sat at the table, his movements precise and detached. He reached for his coffee without looking up, his gaze locked onto the glowing screen of his phone. She tried to bridge the distance with a simple comment about the weather, her voice sounding thin and intrusive in the quiet room. He offered a short, clipped nod, his thumb never pausing its rhythmic scroll. She watched him, noting the way he avoided her eyes, his posture rigid and closed off. It was a morning of carefully curated normalcy, a performance of a life they were no longer living. There was no lingering touch, no shared glance, only the sharp click of the deadbolt as he left. She stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence rushing back. The apartment felt cavernous once he was gone. Amanda began to clear the table, her movements mechanical and slow. She gathered his discarded belongings from the hallway, intending to organize the space he had left in such a hurry. She picked up the heavy coat he had left draped over the chair, intending to hang it in the closet. As she lifted the weight of the fabric, a small, folded slip of paper slid from the inner pocket and fluttered to the floor. She knelt to retrieve it, her fingers brushing against the crisp, thermal-printed paper. It was a hotel receipt, dated from the previous weekend. She smoothed the paper against her palm, her eyes scanning the details, a location she did not recognize, a room number, and a timestamp. The air in the room seemed to thin. She stood up, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. The numbers blurred, then sharpened into a cold, undeniable reality. She looked toward the door, then back at the receipt, the silence of the apartment suddenly heavy. She held the proof of his double life. Hours bled into the evening. Amanda stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life, the receipt crushed into a tight ball in her palm. When the key finally turned in the lock, the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. Minho stepped inside, his movements fluid and unbothered. He didn't see her at first, reaching to hang his keys on the hook. She moved before she could talk herself out of it, stepping into his path, blocking his way to the bedroom. He stopped, his brow furrowing in irritation. She held out her hand, the crumpled paper pressed flat against her shaking palm. She didn't speak at first, her breath hitching in her throat, the silence between them stretching until it felt brittle enough to snap. She forced the words out, her voice thin but sharp with a desperate need for clarity. "Explain this," she said, pointing to the hotel name printed on the paper. She took a step closer, forcing him to look at the evidence. "I found this in your pocket. I need to know why you were there." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the pounding in her ears. She watched his eyes, waiting for a sign of guilt, or even a simple denial. The room went deathly still. Amanda stood with her arm extended. The crumpled receipt still held out like a weapon, but the weapon had no target. Minho did not reach for it. He did not even blink. He simply let his gaze slide past her, drifting toward the blank, off-white surface of the living room wall. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a stuttered excuse or a defensive gesture. He just stood there, his shoulders dropping into a posture of complete, hollow detachment. The clock on the wall ticked, each second feeling like a hammer blow in the suffocating quiet. Amanda watched his face, searching for a twitch of the jaw or a narrowing of the eyes, but there was nothing. His features remained perfectly smooth, a mask of chilling indifference that made her feel as though she were speaking to a ghost. He shifted his weight, turning his body slightly so that he was no longer facing her directly, effectively erasing her from the space. He stared at a single spot on the plaster, his focus fixed with a terrifying, absolute intensity that had nothing to do with her. The air between them grew heavy, stagnant, and cold. He was physically present, yet he had already retreated into a place where she could not follow, leaving her standing in the center of the room with nothing but the silence to answer her. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire ready to snap. Amanda's hand dropped to her side, the paper falling to the floor. She waited for a denial, a lie, or even a shout, but the room remained vacuum-sealed in its quiet. Finally, Minho moved. He did not look at her, but he shifted his neck, the muscles working under his skin as he turned his head. His eyes met hers, but there was no spark, no recognition, not even the remnants of the affection they had shared for months. He looked through her as if she were a pane of glass. He exhaled, a slow, steady release of air that seemed to deflate the entire room. He did not step closer. He did not reach out to soften the blow. He simply opened his mouth, his voice flat and devoid of any tremor. "I think we are just different, Amanda." The words hung in the air, stripped of any apology or attempt at comfort. He did not offer a reason. He did not explain the hotel or the weeks of distance. He simply turned his back on her, his posture rigid and final, effectively closing the door on everything they had built together. Amanda stood frozen, her lungs refusing to draw a full breath. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something heavy and inert. She stared at the back of his head, waiting for him to turn around, waiting for him to laugh or retract the statement, but he remained a statue. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each beat marking the death of their shared life. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand a reason, but her throat felt constricted, as if she had swallowed glass. She took a half step forward, her foot scraping against the hardwood floor, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Minho did not flinch. He did not acknowledge her movement. He remained locked in his position, his shoulders squared against her, effectively shutting her out of his world. She looked around the room, seeing the remnants of their time together, the coffee mugs on the counter, the books on the shelf, and suddenly, they looked like artifacts. She was a stranger in her own home, trapped in the vacuum of his unyielding indifference. The reality of his departure settled over her, cold and heavy. The silence finally broke, not with words, but with the sharp click of a lock. Min-ho moved toward the entryway with mechanical precision. He did not look back. He grabbed his keys from the bowl, the metal jingling with a sound that felt abrasive in the quiet room. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and shoved it into his bag without checking the screen. Every movement was efficient, practiced, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Amanda watched his hand hover over the door handle. She wanted to grab his arm, to force him to look at her one last time, but her muscles refused to obey. He turned the handle, the latch retracting with a metallic snap. He stepped out into the hallway, the light from the corridor spilling into their apartment for a brief second, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He pulled the door shut. The thud was final, vibrating through the floorboards and settling into her bones. The lock clicked into place. She was alone. She walked to the window, watching the street below, but he was already gone, swallowed by the city, leaving her in the absolute stillness. The days dissolved into a gray, repetitive loop. Amanda moved through the city like a ghost, her existence defined by the rhythm of the subway doors sliding open and shut. She spent hours underground, watching the fluorescent lights flicker against the tunnel walls, counting the stops until she reached nowhere. The air in the carriages was stale, smelling of damp wool and ozone. She sat on the hard plastic seats, staring at her own reflection in the dark glass, but the face looking back seemed to belong to someone else. She tried to walk the streets she once navigated with ease, but the paths felt alien. The neon signs blurred into streaks of cold, electric color that offered no warmth. She boarded the trains at dawn and stayed on until the final stop, just to avoid the silence of her empty apartment. Every station was the same, a rush of people, the screech of metal on metal, and the mechanical voice announcing the next stop. The academy office smelled of toner and burnt coffee. Amanda pushed the glass door open, her ID badge heavy against her hip. She expected the usual morning briefing, the stack of student essays waiting for her red pen. Instead, the director sat behind a desk piled high with ledger sheets. He did not look up when she entered. He gestured to the empty chair, the movement sharp and dismissive. She sat, her hands resting on her knees, waiting for the routine greeting. It never came. He slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany surface. It was a formal notice of contract termination. The words were printed in bold, clinical black ink. "Budget cuts," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. He did not meet her eyes. She reached for the document, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth paper. She started to speak, but he held up a hand. The conversation was over before it had truly begun. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. She walked out into the hallway. She held the paper tight, the edges digging into her palm. The academy was behind her now, a closed door, and the city outside felt suddenly, violently larger. The apartment door clicked shut, locking out the noise of the street. Amanda dropped her bag on the floor, the sound muffled by the thin carpet. She walked to the small kitchen table, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. It felt light, almost hollow. She turned it upside down, shaking the contents onto the wood. A few coins clattered, rolling toward the edge, and a single crumpled bill lay flat. She smoothed it out with her thumb. $50. That was the sum of her life in this city. She counted the coins twice, then a third time, staring at the small pile, as if the numbers might shift. They did not. The reality of the amount settled in her chest, heavy and cold. She walked to the window and looked down at the street lamps. Every light represented a place she could not afford to be. She checked her phone for messages, but the screen remained dark. No job, no safety net, no path forward. She sat down on the floor, the wood hard against her back, and watched the shadows stretch across the room. The silence was no longer empty. It was a weight. The apartment was a graveyard of cardboard boxes. Amanda sat in the center of the room, her back against the cold wall, surrounded by the remnants of 3 years. She reached for a stack of books, her fingers trembling as she tried to slide them into a carton. The cardboard tore under her grip, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed in the quiet space. She let the books fall. They hit the floor with a dull thud. scattering across the floorboards. She did not reach to pick them up. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights flickered like dying embers. Every box represented a choice she had made, a path she had taken, and now they were just containers for things she no longer needed. She pulled her knees to her chest, the fabric of her coat rough against her skin. The air in the room felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust and old paper. She looked at her hands, palms up, empty. There was nothing left to organize, nothing left to pack. The silence of the apartment was absolute, a crushing weight that stripped away the last of her defenses. She closed her eyes, the darkness behind her lids mirroring the void in the room. The shadows in the room deepened, but Amanda did not move. She stared at a small wooden box near her feet, a gift from Minho from their first month together. She reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth grain, and pulled it toward her. It felt like a relic from a life that belonged to someone else. She traced the lid, remembering how she had molded her entire schedule, her moods, and her ambitions around his availability. Every decision she made had been a satellite orbiting his needs. She realized then that she had been shrinking herself to fit into the spaces he left open. She had let her own voice, her own goals, and her own identity drift into the dark corners of this apartment, hidden behind his indifference. She pushed the box away, watching it slide across the floorboards until it hit the wall with a sharp click. The sound snapped her focus back to the present. She had been waiting for him to tell her who she was, and in doing so, she had become a ghost in her own story. The realization was not a sudden burst of light, but a cold, steady clarity. She was not a passenger in his life. She was the one who had stopped driving her own. She remained on the floor for a long moment, the floorboards cold against her palms. She looked at the walls, realizing she had spent 3 years building a life that relied entirely on his approval. Every time she had checked her phone, every time she had waited for his text, she had been handing over pieces of her own agency. She was not a person to him. She was a reflection of his own convenience. She pushed herself up, her muscles stiff from the hours of sitting. She walked to the hallway mirror, her movements slow and deliberate. The woman in the glass looked back with tired eyes. But the posture was changing. She stood straight, shoulders back, and looked directly into her own pupils. She had traveled thousands of miles to find a new version of herself, yet she had spent the last year trying to shrink into the mold he created. The validation she craved was never going to come from him because he was incapable of seeing the person standing right in front of him. She touched the surface of the mirror, her reflection steady and unblinking. She was done waiting for permission to exist. She turned away from the glass, her gaze fixed on the door, ready to leave the silence of the apartment behind. She pulled her suitcases from the closet, the wheels clicking against the floor. She did not pack for Kentucky. She did not pack for a return to the life she had left 3 years ago. She packed for Busan. She dragged the bags out of the apartment, locking the door behind her for the last time. The subway ride to the station was quiet, the city lights outside the window blurring into long, fading streaks of color. She boarded the train heading south, watching the dense architecture of Seoul dissolve into the dark, open countryside. The further she traveled, the lighter the weight in her chest became. She realized that Minho was never the source of her stability. He was the anchor pulling her down into the stillness of his own indifference. She left that version of herself on the platform. The air here was different. It carried the sharp, salt-heavy scent of the ocean. She walked toward the exit, her pace steady and rhythmic. She stood at the station exit, the bustle of Busan swirling around her. People moved with purpose, their voices a low hum against the rhythmic crashing of the tide nearby. She checked the address of her new apartment one last time, the paper crisp and firm in her hand. She did not look back at the train. She did not check her phone for messages that would never come. She dropped her bags for a second to adjust her grip, feeling the weight of her own belongings. She walked into the street, her boots striking the pavement with a sharp, clear sound. She found the building, pushed open the heavy glass door, and stepped into the lobby. She climbed the stairs, one floor at a time, until she reached her door. She unpacked the first box, the cardboard flaps folding back with a dry, rhythmic snap. She placed her books on the windowsill, one by one, lining them up against the incoming sea breeze. She found a small, forgotten notebook at the bottom of her bag, a relic of the life she had left behind, and dropped it into the trash bin. The room felt sparse, but it was hers. She walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic roar of the waves hitting the harbor wall. She moved to the center of the room and stood still, feeling the floorboards beneath her feet. There were no messages to check. She walked back to the window, leaned her forearms against the frame, and looked out at the dark water. She reached out and latched the window shut, secured the space she had claimed. She walked to the bed and sat down. The room stayed quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Amanda stood up from the bed, her movements deliberate and slow. She walked to the desk, cleared away the remaining packing tape and stray scraps of paper, and wiped the surface clean with a damp cloth. The wood grain emerged, dark and smooth under the lamplight. She pulled out a fresh notepad and a pen, placing them side by side in the center of the desk. She walked to the closet, hung up her coat, and smoothed the fabric with her palm. She returned to the window, pulling the curtains shut. The room darkened, shifting into a soft, private shadow. She walked to the light switch, pressed it down, and the space fell into a deep, steady calm. She lay down, the sheets cool against her skin, and stared up at the ceiling. Outside, the tide continued its steady, rhythmic push against the shore. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the water, and let her breathing match the pace of the waves. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over a city that belonged entirely to her. She shifted once, settled her weight, and drifted into sleep. Sunlight cut through the gap in the curtains, hitting the floor in a sharp, bright line. Amanda opened her eyes, sat up, and swung her feet onto the cool floor. She stood, stretched, and walked to the door, turning the lock with a firm, audible click. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of salt and roasting coffee. She stepped onto the pavement, the city of Busan already moving around her. She navigated the narrow alleys of the morning market, dodging crates of silverfish and baskets of bright red peppers. She stopped at a stall, exchanged coins for a warm bun, and kept moving. The steam rose from the bread, curling into the cool morning air. She walked past the crowded bus stops and the rows of storefronts, her stride steady and rhythmic. She reached the harbor front, where the wind whipped against her face, pulling at her hair. She did not look back. She watched the fishing boats leave the dock, their engines humming a low, steady bass. She tightened her grip on her bag, turned toward the city center, and began to walk. Every step was hers. Every choice was hers. She disappeared into the crowd. The path widened as she reached the coastal promenade. Amanda walked until the concrete gave way to a stone pier jutting into the gray expanse of the sea. She stopped at the very end, where the spray from the crashing waves misted the air. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, worn transit card from Seoul, and let it fall into the churning water below. It vanished instantly. She watched the spot where it sank, then turned her back on the horizon. She began to walk back toward the city, her pace quickening as the morning traffic grew louder. She passed a row of glass-fronted shops, seeing her own reflection in the windows, a woman moving with purpose, unburdened. She reached the main intersection, waited for the light to change, and stepped off the curb when the signal turned green. She wove through the morning commuters, her presence firm and undeniable. The past was a closed chapter, left behind in the salt air. Amanda entered the academy building, her boots clicking against the polished linoleum floor. She walked to the office, greeted the director with a firm nod, and sat at the desk. She pulled a pen from her bag, opened the folder, and signed the contract on the dotted line. The ink dried in a clean, dark stroke. She stood, shook the director's hand, and walked out into the hallway. She left the building and stepped into the bustling street, where the sounds of vendors and traffic formed a familiar, steady rhythm. She bought a coffee, felt the warmth of the cup against her palms, and walked toward her apartment building. She climbed the stairs, unlocked her door, and stepped inside to the quiet space she had organized herself. She walked to the balcony, pushed the glass door open, and leaned against the railing. Below, the city lights of Busan flickered to life. Amanda cleared the last of her desk, stacking notebooks and pens into neat, organized piles. She picked up a small framed photograph from the corner of the shelf, studied the faces for a single heartbeat, and placed it face down in the waste bin. She did not hesitate. She walked to the kitchen, rinsed her mug, and set it on the drying rack. The apartment was quiet, the air smelling of fresh coffee and sea salt. She grabbed her bag, checked the lock on the door, and stepped out into the hallway. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. She descended to the lobby, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The morning sun hit the pavement, warming the concrete beneath her feet. She started walking toward the station, her stride long and rhythmic. She reached the corner, paused to check the crosswalk, and stepped into the flow of the city. She was moving forward, not looking back. She reached the station entrance, descended the stairs, and disappeared into the morning commute. She was exactly where she needed to be. Amanda walked past the final row of buildings until the concrete gave way to sand. The sound of the city faded, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of the tide hitting the shore. She stopped near the waterline, the cold spray misting against her skin. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the old transit card she had used for months of aimless travel, and tossed it into the surf. It disappeared into the foam. She watched the waves pull back, dragging the sand beneath her feet. She turned her back to the city and faced the horizon. The wind whipped her hair, but she did not tuck it away. She stood firm, heels sinking into the wet-packed earth. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sharp, salt-heavy air. The sky was turning a pale, clear violet. She turned and began to walk along the shoreline, her pace steady and her gaze fixed on the open sea ahead. Amanda moved along the wet sand, her boots leaving deep, clear prints that the incoming tide immediately erased. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of a rounded stone. She picked it up, feeling the weight and the grit of the salt against her palm. She squeezed it once, then let it drop back into the dark water. The splash was small, quickly swallowed by the roar of the surf. She kept walking, her shoulders square and her stride unhurried. The shoreline curved ahead, disappearing into the mist of the evening. She passed a cluster of driftwood, stepped over a tangle of kelp, and continued toward the edge of the bay. The lights of the distant town began to flicker on, but she did not turn to look. She kept her eyes on the line where the dark water met the darkening sky. Her breathing remained slow and even, synchronized with the movement of the sea. She reached the end of the beach where the cliffs rose up, turned toward the path leading inland, and began the climb. She did not stop. She did not look back. The path narrowed as it wound up the side of the cliff, the earth hardening under her boots. Amanda pushed forward, her hands steady against the rough stone of the embankment. She reached the summit, where the wind hit her with renewed force, carrying the scent of pine and salt. She stood at the edge, looking down at the coastline she had just traversed. The beach was a thin, dark ribbon against the vast expanse of the ocean. She adjusted her footing, shifting her weight to balance against the gusts. Below, the water churned, white foam visible even in the fading light. She turned her gaze away from the sea and toward the road stretching out before her. It was a long, winding stretch of asphalt, empty and silent. She took a step, then another, her rhythm unbroken. The horizon ahead remained clear as she walked into the deepening twilight, leaving the coast behind, fully committed to the path she had chosen for herself. The coastal ridge gave way to a paved road that cut through the low hills. Amanda stepped onto the asphalt, the surface smooth and cool under her feet. She walked past a metal signpost, its reflective surface catching the dim light, but she did not slow down to read the destination. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching as the yellow line stretched into the dark. Her pace was steady, a rhythmic strike of boot against stone. She passed a small, silent farmhouse, the windows dark and the yard empty. A dog barked once from behind a fence, then went quiet. She did not flinch, her focus remaining entirely on the path. The air grew cooler as she moved further inland, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. She reached a junction where the road split into two, but she chose the wider path without hesitation. She walked until the sound of the ocean was replaced by the rustle of trees. Her silhouette grew smaller against the vast expanse of the landscape. She moved with a deliberate, measured gait, her body language signaling a complete break from the past. She walked until she became a small, singular point of motion in the quiet, dark expanse of the world, moving forward into the night. The road leveled out as the hills receded. Amanda slowed her pace, the rhythmic sound of her boots on the pavement softening. She stopped near a cluster of tall grass, the blades brushing against her legs in the breeze. Above, the first stars appeared, sharp points of light in the darkening sky. She stood still, her chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and cooling stone. She reached out, brushing her hand against the rough bark of a roadside tree, feeling the texture under her fingertips. She stood there for a long moment, observing the silence of the landscape. Then, she turned back to the road. She resumed her walk, her stride long and even. She moved past the final bend, her figure silhouetted against the dim horizon. She did not look back. She kept her gaze forward, her body moving with a fluid, natural grace. Please, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel for more love and emotional stories.